the students, these are master students, right?
Yes, these are the graduate students, MR1 and MR2, and they will be graduating in September.
Good, so we're not kids, we're
no.
grown-ups. So
Depends.
I can assume that they have already heard the name of Marshall McLuhan. Marshall McLuhan, you see him here in a movie. Well, one is Woody Allen, the other is Marshall McLuhan. But this is in the late 70s, when Marshall McLuhan was already at the death and a star, impersonating himself in a Woody Allen movie. But he became famous for things he wrote in the 60s, particularly a book, Understanding Media, published in 1964, where he famously claimed that the medium is the message. You already heard that, right? It's still, you know, a famous slogan. That was 1964. And McLuhan was referring to the new global village of electronic communication brought about by radio and television. That was the 60s. But let's take McLuhan's statement at face value and try to apply outside of its original technical context and transfer it to today. What's our medium today? I mean, right now, for this lecture. It's Zoom, evidently, so was the message. The main message seems to be that we are meeting somehow, but we are not in your school, nor in mine. I don't know about yours. Mine in London has been locked down for almost 4 months now. And even if our schools were open, I could not meet you in yours, you could not meet me in mine, because nobody can travel between Europe and America right now, with a few exceptions. It is forbidden, and besides very few planes are still flying. So again, what's the message here? The message is that the global travel and transportation infrastructure of mechanical modernity, the infrastructure that was essential to the functioning of the modern industrial world, has come to a grinding halt. It has stopped. It has ceased to be. It's not functioning anymore. And with it, the entire technical logic of the modern industrial machine-made environment has simply imploded. This is what many today call the anthropocene, meaning the modern mechanical world issued from the Industrial Revolution and based on standardized mass production, global mechanical transportation, and the unlimited burning of fossil fuels. What we have seen for the last 4 months is simply the collapse of that world, the collapse of the Anthropocene. We all thought that the Anthropocene would come to an end little by little and over time due to global warming and climate change. Instead, the end of the Anthropocene came by way of global infection, not global warming, and viral change, not climate change, viral change. And it came suddenly, the space of a fortnight, last March. And for sure, the speed and timing of the catastrophe were unprecedented. And yet for us, in the design professions, the end of the Anthropocene by itself should not have come as a surprise. After all, we had long been arguing that the technical logic of industrial modernity was obsolete, but it was due to be replaced by the technical logic of post-industrial electronic computation. In particular, we had long been claiming that the electronic transmission of information is faster, cheaper, and smarter, more environmentally sustainable than the mechanical transportation of people and goods. And likewise, we had long been claiming that the distributed, digitally mass customized fabrication of physical goods is faster, cheaper, smarter, and more environmentally sustainable than standardized mechanical mass production. The global catastrophe of the last 4 months has tragically vindicated many of our long-held assumptions. Let's take a practical example. To keep to our daily experience for the last 4 months, to the way we have experienced the lockdown in education, as I am a teacher and you are students, let's review briefly the way we have been teaching and studying since COVID came last March and our schools shut down. You will not be surprised to learn that since I'm a teacher, one weekend last March, without forewarning, all of a sudden, I had to transfer all my classes, lectures, tutorials, seminars, from real classes to virtual ones, trying to figure out what we can and cannot do in this new electronic format. This, for example, is a seminar at Yale in April. You may recognize on the screen Peter Eisenman, who was perfectly at ease on Zoom first time he tried. What you would say I'd been training for that for his whole life. I don't know how he managed, but he did wonderfully. Now, all the media we use inevitably feedback on the kind of messages we can convey. This is, at this point, you will all understand a complicated matter. For me, unlike for Peter Eisenman, it was a particularly steep learning curve because I had no experience in remote teaching. I had never done it before. So I had plenty of catching up to do, technically and intellectually. This is where I had to stop and ask myself, why on earth did I not at least try to start and practice some e-teaching or distance education a bit earlier? Why did I wait so long? Why did I not start long ago? All the technology we use today to teach remotely has been widely available, at least on campuses, since the mid-90s, 25 years ago. And many bold and daring experiments of e-learning and virtual classes were tested and tried back then in the 90s, when the technology was new and promising and exciting, and many thought it would change teaching forever and for the better. I think, for example, of the early work of Mark Taylor, a Derrida scholar, professor of religion and philosophy, now at Columbia, but then at Williams College. What you see here is the table of contents of a book he published in 1994, titled Imagologist. Each term is the title of a class, which in 1994, he taught jointly from Williams College and the University of Helsinki. That at the time was science fiction. Students in Helsinki, he teaching in Williamstown, and the other way around. And they did it in published in 1994, probably in 1993. In spite of such an early and promising start, e-teaching never really caught on. Even in more recent times, the rise of MOOCs, meaning massive open online courses, has been widely dismissed. And MOOCs have often been disparaged by the global academic establishment, as well as seen with suspicion by community activists. But then, if we stop again and step back and have a look at the bigger picture again, it becomes evident that this pattern I just described is sequenced in 2 steps. First, the rise of technological optimism in the 90s, followed by a complete reversal, a deep distrust of all digital technologies as of the early 2000s, and often to this day. Now, this pattern of rise and fall, rise in the 90s and fall in the noughties, is part to a larger, more general trend. And this is a trend that we in the design profession are quite familiar with. This is a story that was at least in part of our own making. This is where it all started. Folding in architecture, guest edited by Greg Lynn, with a strong participation by Peter Eisenman. For better or worse, starting from the early 90s, we were among the inventors, the protagonists, the pioneers of the first digital term. We embraced and adopted digital tools for notation, design, calculation, and fabrication sooner than many other trades and professions. And in the process, we came up with ideas that have shaped our general understanding of digital technologies and of digital culture at large. The story of the invention of a digital term in architecture in the 90s is now well known. It's already in the history books. Back then, in the 90s, designers and architects were the first to understand the revolutionary potential of seamless CAD-CAM integration, the continuity between digital design and digital fabrication. But new technical logic promised the mass production of variations at no extra cost. And some of us around that time, which is the mid-90s, came up with a new conceptual framework to define this new technical object and to come to terms with this new way of making, which we now call digital mass customization, non-standard seriality, the serial reproduction of non-identical parts, the mass production of variations at no extra cost. At the same time, new parametric software like this one, this is a recent release, but the first release came out in 1991 or 92 for the design of complex geometrical shapes and smooth, streamlined surfaces in particular. This created a new generation of architectural forms, which around that time, Greg Lynn started calling blobs. Blobs have since taken over the world. They're still thriving. They are not called blobs anymore, but they should be, because that's what they are. But this is another story, which we can discuss in another occasion, in another lecture. However, parallel to this story, which is about digital tectonics, CAD-CAM, notation, calculation, fabrication, there was another story unfolding at the same time, deeply intertwined with it, and often told by the same protagonist, often in the same schools and venues. In 1995, Bill Mitchell, then the Dean of Architecture and Planning at the MIT, published this seminal little book, where, among many other things, he tells this story. But not exactly this story. I'm going to tell you Mitchell's story as I remember telling it to my French students because I was teaching in Paris at that time. So I had to slightly adapt Mitchell's story to the European context. Imagine what you do when you go out in the morning in Paris for a cup of coffee. There's this tiny little square next to where you live, typical Parisian square. There is the tube station called the metro in Paris, and there is a kiosk on the right where you go and you buy a newspaper, Le Monde or Le Figaro, whatever. And now Mitchell said, well, this is what you do today, but tomorrow you will no longer buy a newspaper in print because you will read your newspaper online. It was 1995. He said, oh, sure. I believe it when I see it. And he went on and said, well, on the left, there is a bank branch, Société Générale, where you go to paperwork or to take some money out of an ATM. But you know, money is information. And soon this information can be processed online. You will check your account online and you will pay online because money is information. You will send it in bits and bytes. No need to use cash. No need to even use a credit card. Information travels on the internet. People said, yes, I believe it when I see it. But on the opposite side is a travel agent where at the time you had to go to buy a plane ticket. Mitchell said, well, soon you will see on your screen an offer of flights, and you will see the price, you check and pay, and you will not need to go to a travel agent anymore. You said, yeah, sure. I believe it when it comes. And on the opposite side, there is a post office. Mitchell said, well, you will not need to go to the post office that much anymore, because most of your mail will become email, electronic mail. Now, in America, on campuses, they already had it, but in Europe, we didn't. So people said, email, what the heck is that? Then you go to a store, a record store, to buy a CD. Vinyl was already replaced by the CD at the time, it was the 90s. We just said, soon you will not buy a physical CD because you will download all the music from a universal catalog of all the music in the world, and you will see it online, download it. And people said, it's impossible, 1996. But in 1999, Napsters came, which worked just fine. The problem, it was illegal. So after a while, they had to shut it down because it wasn't paying royalties, it was stealing music. But then iTunes came, which found a way to make money out of it. And then Mitchell went on and said, then you think you must go to the library? Well, in Paris, we had this huge, brand new library, just inaugurated. And you may know not so much the building as built, but the competition, because Remcolas participated and they lost, because Perrault won and they built this très grande bibliothèque, inaugurated in December 1996. So around the time of the story I'm telling you, which is why it was part of the story I was telling my student at that time. That is the library of the future, they said. Imagine each reader inside the building would have access to a computer terminal to check the library catalog online. I've never seen that. And also at some point in the future, you will go to the library to actually read books and documents in electronic facsimiles or copies without retrieving the original document. I'm not making this up. I remember the name of a famous French politician slash philosopher slash universal consultant slash personal friend of François Mitterrand, and the president, who said this on national TV on the day of the inauguration. And I remember that already at that time, December 1996, someone said, well, if that is the plan, why should we go and take a seat inside the building at all? Could we not read that online, say on the internet? And if we can do that online, then what's that building for? Do we need that building for a function which, it appears, for most readers soon will not exist anymore? Why should you build a building to read a book which you can read from your computer wherever you are? The question was occasionally asked, timidly, evidently, but as the building was just built and cost billions, everyone agreed in France at the time that it was not polite to keep asking that embarrassing question. The internet, that was the place where all this stuff, meaning most of our life, was soon meant to be taking place. And yet, even if the internet is the protagonist of Mitchell's book, the term itself does not even show in the title, nor on the book cover. Space, place, and the infoban. What the heck is the infoban? Apparently, this is what Mitchell meant. You see the caption? The infoban goes in. Telephone workers install fiber optic cabling. It's 1995. Fiber optic, the infrastructure needed to run the internet. I do not even know if the term infoban ever existed in German, or if it was a pure American invention from the start. The current equivalent in American English at the time, mid-90s, would have been the information superhighway. But many prefer to use another synonym, cyberspace. That is a term we don't use much anymore, but it was hugely popular back then. Most in the audience cannot remember that because they were not born, but there were several AD issues like this one, Architecting Cyberspace 1, 2, 3, I don't even remember how many precisely, all of them in the second half of the 90s. Just as a footnote, the term cyberspace has nothing to do with Norbert Wiener's cybernetics, as in the title of Wiener's book, which was published in 1948. Cybernetics was Norbert Wiener's new science of control and communication in the animal and the machine, as you read on the title, which basically meant for Wiener the new science of feedback and interactivity. The term cyberspace was minted much later, not in 1948, but in 1984, easy to remember. Invert the two last digits. Wiener, 48. 84, not a scientist, but a noted science fiction writer, William Gibson, in this book, Neuromancer, where cyberspace, a term which he made up out of thin air, although probably inspired by Norbert Wiener, it meant some sort of electronic alternative to physical space, where things happen not to humans, but to non-physical avatars. That was science fiction. However, only a few years later, something very similar to Gibson, science fictional cyberspace, started to materialize in very technical, practical, usable terms. That was, of course, the internet. That was a cartoon from the New Yorkers, it was very popular around 1998. You can still find it if you Google it. Now, the term internet itself was not new, nor was the technology. As is well known, both derive from an older military network called the ARPANET. But in 1989 and 1990, Tim Berners-Lee, then working in Geneva at the European Center for Atomic Research, he invented the HTTP, the HTML, hence the World Wide Web, with this paper, which he published in March 1989. This is the original photostat of a paper which was circulated at CERN in Geneva in March 1989. This technology gave to every user of the internet the possibility to surf the web, the possibility to navigate the entire internet, one hyperlink to the next, without having to type in a new internet address for each connection to a different server. Today we take it for granted because we surf the internet from our phones. But at the time, it was a revolutionary leap forward, because prior to that, for each server, you had to type in a different URL. So it took forever. It was a pain in the neck. Full disclosure, I was living and working in Geneva at exactly that time. And I had absolutely no way to know that in an office on the same campus, a few blocks from mine, Tim Berners-Lee was inventing something that would change the history of the world. I would only found out a few years later, like everyone else. So much about the power of place. I may have met Tim Berners-Lee at the university cafe many times. I didn't even know who he was, if I had known. But anyway, with the WWW, the World Wide Web, the internet suddenly became a user-friendly space, ready for popular use, prime for commercial exploitation. Many started to think that the internet would be the future of retail. Amazon sold its first book on the internet in the summer of 1995. The company was not called Amazon, it was called as it still is, Amazon.com. From the start, the name of the company was its internet address, or more precisely, its URL, its address on the www, the World Wide Web. And these are a few taglines I remember from that distant time, from black and white to bits and bytes, that refer to the transition from print to electronic media, from brick and mortar to virtual reality, because yes, the term virtual reality was already largely in use in the early 90s. And even in the late 90s, the virtual reality markup language, VRML, it didn't really work, but the idea was already there. And this is the last line from a noted digital media pundit of the time: for every megabyte of memory you install on your hard disk, 1 square foot of retail space downtown will disappear. Strange as it may seem today, back then, everyone thought that was a splendid idea. Many started to remark that the electronic transmission of information cost less than the mechanical transportation of people and goods. Think of the advantage of reading a scholarly article from your office or from your couch without having to travel to a faraway library. I think that the expression couch potato was invented around that time, or perhaps it was already around due to the television and to the remote control. I don't know. Around that time, some also started to point out that a reduction in the mechanical transportation of persons and goods could be environmentally good, or as we would say today, would reduce our carbon footprint. But Bill Mitchell didn't stop there. As he was an architect and an urban theorist, he pointed out that the rise of the internet meant simply the end of a modernist city, which you see here in one of its most famous prefigurations. The city of industrial modernity, based on the separation of function and their concentration in specialized zones, part of the city where we live but we do not work. Another part of the city where we work but we do not live. Another where we shop, we go to the movies or have fun, but we never live or work there. Hence permanently commuting, by car mostly, from one place to the next. This, Mitchell argued, was over. With the shift from mechanical transportation to electronic transmission, many of these activities could be transacted anywhere, because they would mostly take place on the internet. Hence, the functional segregation of modernist cities could stop. Cities could go back to being integrated, organic, multifunctional, multi-purposes, and messy, as they had always been before the rise of modern urbanism. You see at the bottom the mess, which Le Corbusier didn't like, at the top the new vision of an ordered, sorted, well-ordered city, la ville classée, a sorted city. La ville pêle-mêle is the messy city. And then, most likely, many of these dispersed, distributed, despecialized activities would merge at some point to consolidate in a new, reconfigured, electronically connected physical place, a dwelling, a new domestic space, home. No longer at home, but at home. You see how Bill Mitchell spelled it in 1995. 1995, most people had never seen that sign. I didn't know, but it meant the internet, at home. At home is the old way. At home, spelled that way, is the future. At home is the past. At home with the internet is the future. That was 1995. Well, it's 2020, July 13. Where have we been for the last 4 months? Now that we are obliged to do that at home, 18 hours a day, we do not enjoy it very much, evidently. Yet 25 years ago, everyone thought that despatialization, the migration of human activities from physical space to cyberspace, was a very good idea. In 1995, we all thought that that was the future. And that future, seen from 1995, looked good. Digitally intelligent designers, the digital avant-garde of the time, they were not the only ones to be sold to the idea. It was a general leap of faith, a sudden surge of unrestrained enthusiasm for the redemptive power of the internet. The digital revolution was seen as the final fix for almost every problem created by the Industrial Revolution. The digital revolution was meant to be the end and nemesis of the industrial age. If he had lived to see that, Karl Marx could have said that the digital age was the inevitable overcoming of the industrial age. As overcome is a bad translation. There is a famous German word, which is 2 lines long, which is the typical Karl Marx word in German, the bypassing, the overcoming. It's the Hegelian idea that you move forward the next step. But nobody was reading Karl Marx in 1995. Instead, everyone started buying internet companies on the stock exchange. That was the beginning of what we now call the internet bubble. The valuation of all .com companies, companies with a dot and a com in their name, implying that they were doing business on the internet, often just suggesting that they would do so at some point. Now, this valuation skyrocketed. Between January 1995 and March 2000, the NASDAQ Composite Index, where many of these young companies, startups, were quoted, rose by almost 600%. Most of the rise was in the last 3 years of the century. The then chairman of the Federal Reserve of the United States, Alan Greenspan, famously said that that was not due to irrational exuberance. Valuations were soaring because the internet made our work in general more productive. Many things easier to find, buy, or sell, hence cheaper. Thanks to the internet, we were told we were all doing more with less. More work, more reading, more teaching, more learning, more researching, more interacting, more dating, you name it. These newfound riches in the year after the fall of the Berlin Wall were often called the dividends of peace, an invention probably invented by Bill Clinton, I'm not certain. But the meteoric rise, the valuation of the .com companies of the time could equally have been called the dividends of despatialization. Cyberspace costs less than physical space, and it works better. Therefore, when the economy in general moves from physical space to cyberspace to the internet, we all become wealthier, richer. Well, if that seemed too good to be true, it's because it wasn't. The NASDAQ peaked on March 10, 2000, 20 years and 4 months ago, almost to the day. It lost 80% of its value in the 18 months that followed. That was the .com crash, also known as the burst of the internet bubble. Many tech companies disappeared. Amazon itself, for example, barely survived by the skin of its teeth after losing 88% of its market capitalization in 6 months. The NASDAQ took 15 years to go back to its value of March 2000, which was reached again only in 2015. Stock exchange crashes tend to coincide with deep and sudden changes in culture and society at large. The dot-com crash was no exception. As the Nasdaq plunged in 2000 and 2001, the general mood shifted suddenly from techno-friendly to technophobic. In the contrite climate of those post-crash years, which were also the post-9/11 years, few still saw the internet as a benevolent or even as a promising technology. The anti-internet backlash was swift and predictable. As many had warned from the start, technology should not replace human contact. There can be no community without physical proximity. For Christian phenomenologists, always overrepresented in the design profession, the elision of human dialogue started with the invention of alphabetic writing. If we write, use a technology, the alphabet, to transmit our voice to others in our absence, in the absence of our body. People can read our voice without hearing our voice. That was the original scene of all media technologies, disembodiment. After that, things would only get from bad to worse. The internet was just more of the same. And the backlash continued, in a sense, to this day. A few years into the new millennium, the so-called social media reinvented the internet. But in recent times, we have learned to fear their intrusion on our privacy. Moreover, by abolishing all traditional tools for thoughtful moderation and giving unmediated voice to so many dissenters, outliers, and misfits, the internet is seen by many as the primary technical cause of the rise of populism. And that may as well be true, regrettably, although I suspect that if I had been a Roman Catholic priest around 1540, I would have said exactly the same of the use of the new barbaric technology of print by the like of John Calvin in Geneva or Martin Luther in Wittenberg. Now, I wrote a first draft of this paper a few weeks ago while self-isolating in my London apartment, like hundreds of millions of Europeans contemplating the unfolding of an unspeakable man-made catastrophe created by human error and compounded by political cynicism, criminal miscalculations, and incompetence. For more than 3 months, the internet was literally my lifeline. It was all I had. From my windows, I used to see in the distance the uninterrupted flow of airplanes gliding into Heathrow, evenly spaced, 3 minutes from one another. For the last 4 months, I could only see a handful. By the way, I wonder what for and for whom. Only a few months ago, Greta Thunberg could still incite us by words and deed to flight shaming, meaning to shame those flying due to the notorious carbon footprint of air travel. Well, she can rest now. Planes are not flying anymore. She has won her battle big way, although probably not for the right reason or for any good reason she might have anticipated. It appears that as the carbon-heavy economy of the industrial age, or anthropocene, has almost entirely stopped, we may have already staved off the global warming catastrophe, or at least postponed it significantly. Only a few months ago, some climate activists were more or less openly advocating the elimination of part of the human population as the only way to save the planet. Well, there you go. And meanwhile, something we have already learned from the catastrophe is that internet viruses are less lethal than real ones. The coronavirus travel by plane, boat, and rail. And now we know we can only travel by tube, metro, or subway. The coronavirus was born and bred as a pure product of the industrial age. If a few months ago, when this all started, we had already been using more internet and flying less, as we are doing now, by necessity, not by choice, many lives would have been saved because the virus would have had fewer conduits for spreading. So perhaps in retrospect, this is exactly what we should have been doing, what we should have started doing long ago. Sooner or later, schools, offices, factories, and stores will reopen somehow, but at that point, we shall also have learned that the traditional way of working, the mechanical, anthropocenic way of working, is not the only one. We shall have had evidence that in many cases, viable electronic alternatives exist. And when used with due precautions and within reasonable limits, electronic communication can work pretty well. Remote working can already effectively replace plenty of face time, thus making plenty of human travel unnecessary. The alternative to air travel is not sailing boat travel, that's the Greta Thunberg solution, it's Zoom, that's our solution tonight. Blue-collar work cannot yet be despecialized as effectively as white-collar work, but that's not too far away in the future either. Fully automated robotic fabrication is already current in some industries, and in design schools, as you know, we're actually quite good at it. Robotic factories are immune to economies of scale. They can be located closer to their markets, thus reducing the global transportation of mass-produced goods and components. Anecdotally, but meaningfully, right at the start of the pandemic, some among my friends and colleagues, like Manuel Garcia at the Bartlett or Jenny Sabin at Cornell, they started to convert the 3D printers and robotic arms to produce PPE, personal protective equipment, for medics and hospital workers, on site, in specs, on demand. Because this is indeed the point. This is what robotic fabrication was always meant to do. Where needed, when needed, as needed. The same robotic arm that made a Zaha Hadid table set last week can make face shields for medical staff today, 10 miles from a hospital in need. No airport needed for delivery. In fact, these were delivered by bicycle. During the Second World War, the brutality of the war effort had the side effect of showing the effectiveness of modern technologies. And many who had resented and resisted modernism in architecture and design before the war got used to it during the war out of necessity, then adopted and embraced modernism out of choice and without cultural reservation as soon as the war was over. Likewise, the coronavirus crisis may show that many cultural and ideological reservations against the rise of post-industrial digital technologies were based on prejudice or self-interest, not on fact, nor on the common good. From the start of the coronavirus crisis to early April, the Dow Jones Industrial Index lost 1/3 of its value. I take heavy Nasdaq, 1/5. Amazon was nothing. And Zoom Video, the company making the tool we are using tonight, was up 160%. That was before the US government stepped in with a number of colossal financial bailouts that artificially reflated all valuations indifferently. But to this day, the Dow Jones Industrial is down 10%. The tech-heavy Nasdaq is up 20%, and Zoom video is up 300%. In many ways, without the government rescue, which, by the way, may turn out to be only a temporary stopgap, this would already look more and more like the dot-com crash of 20 years ago in reverse. The internet is back. Who would have said? So perhaps the internet was not always, not necessarily, not inevitably such a bad, evil thing after all. I wish I didn't have to say that today in this context. But again, this is what many of us in the design profession started saying 1 generation ago. Back in the 90s, we claimed that industrial modernity was doomed, but digital modernity was the only alternative. After 2001, that quickly became a lost cause, and often an unpopular one. Today, computational postmodernity is no longer a choice, it's our only choice. It's all we have left. And as it happens, in the design professions, we actually have a few ideas on how we could make computational postmodernity work. 1 generation ago, we were among the first to conceptualize and theorize computational postmodernity. We were among the first to try to work with it, to try to make it work. First at small scale, then full size. 1 generation later, we are still among the best in that trade. Today, all the digital and computational experiments we have been testing and trying for the last 30 years, from cyberspace to e-learning, to virtual reality, to augmented reality, to distributed robotic fabrication, were primed and ready to go mainstream. In many ways, many of these computational tools have already gone mainstream, because for the last 4 months, they have been indispensable. Because during the COVID crisis, we were obliged to use them. In the process, we learned how to use them. And we know, and now we know that if used advisedly, some computational tool for communication and for fabrication can actually work. So let's try at least to learn something from the still ongoing catastrophe. This is not the time to repair and relaunch the Anthropocene. This is the time to invent a viable computational alternative to industrial modernity. And we know how to do it because we have been prepping for the last 30 years. So that's my last word for today. Let's go back to work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mario, for the great paper that you delivered to our students. I know you have had a bad day, and so maybe we just...
I can take one or two questions.
Yes, maybe just a couple of questions from the audience, if there is anything very burning that the students would like to ask.
Let me enlarge the screen. Yes, I see you all now. Any questions? I have to feed myself and my cat. It's a practical joke. There is no cat here. The cat is somewhere else. I have to feed myself.
Are you in London, by the way, while we wait for the students to... Okay, so I see in the chat, maybe sometimes people put it in the chat. No, thank you. No, okay, so a lot of thank yous. Are you in London right now?
Yes, I'm still here, unfortunately. Okay. I have plans to go elsewhere, but for the time being, I'm still here. It's complicated, as I mentioned. There are places where I cannot go, places where I could go, but my partner cannot reach me because she has an American passport, so she cannot come to Italy, as you know.
Yes, so it's true. You tried.
We were not married, so she cannot claim that. She cannot claim anything.
Well, can you get married online?
Pardon?
Can you get married online? Talking about online activities, maybe you can.
There are shortcuts in some countries.
was just wondering if that's a possibility.
But imagine arriving at Malpensa and saying, well, we have this document printed from Google saying that you're married. Any doubt, query, or perplexity? Who is Benjamin who said, thank you to everyone? Who's Benjamin? Benjamin. It's you. No, who are you? You're Jesse.
Yeah.
Jesse.
I'll ask.
Go ahead. Where are you?
What's that?
Where are you?
I'm in Los Angeles.
Oh, well, not far from the school.
No, not too far. It's a beautiful sunny day here. And at least here in the US, COVID has kind of been, or can be understood as capitalism's great leap forward in its ability to kind of deregulate labor, to kind of conquer more deeply the kind of governmental protections or fill in and control more of our daily lives.
But if you do that, you will have another virus in 2 years.
What's that? Yeah.
If you do that, in 2 years, there will be another virus, because you already seen that that process brings us to catastrophe. Who would be so crazy to reiterate a system which has already shown it is inherently doomed? We always said it cannot stand up. We always said it is unsustainable. Now it's no longer a point of saying it is unsustainable. We shouldn't claim that it is unsustainable because we have evidence that it is unsustained. It has imploded of its own weight. So people saying that we need to do more of the same, they might as well shoot themselves in the head, not in the foot. Yeah.
And as much as I agree we have a really radical potential for reshaping the world right now, why is a post-digital or a digital post-modernity our only option? Is there not space for a plurality of potentials that
we're talking about technological choices. So in the case of mechanical transportation, we have evidence that if we use electronic transmission, we save the environment and we save our lives. So it's not a matter of, this has a big impact on electronic education. There is a strong rejection of despecialized teaching in many schools. I've seen it, and it is coming from the two opposite ends of the ideological spectrum. How do you say spectrum or ideological? Because in the last week, for example, the most rabid aggression against electronic teaching came from Giorgio Agamben, the Italian philosopher, and Donald Trump. Now, you wouldn't expect that these two people have much in common, but Agamben published a couple of weeks ago a paper in Italian, translated into English, you can find it on the internet, where saying that teachers like me, for example, who teach online as worse than the Nazis. Because the argument is you have to go back to school because if you cannot touch the body of your students, you cannot teach. I mean, and in almost with the same words, Donald Trump reiterated that if students and teachers are not together in the same room at the same time, education cannot happen. Now, I'm happy to be back to school as soon as possible. But so long as the contagion rate is what it is, I prefer not to put anyone's life at risk, including mine. And by the way, the experience of my last 4 months, during which I've been teaching online almost full time, is that in a few instances, I don't want to overstate the point, but in a few instances, Zoom is better than a classroom. Only in a few instances. In others, it doesn't compare. And of course, I teach history and theory, so I don't manipulate, physical stuff. It's just about the transmission of words and occasionally of images. But to teach a lecture, an undergraduate, typical lecture theater, 150 students, I've been doing it in a lecture theater for many years, I had the best exams, the best papers from undergraduate students I ever taught a few weeks ago when a French undergraduate class had an entire term taught by me without ever seeing me in the flesh. Amazing. They actually learned what I was teaching. You know what? You know why? Because they listened to my talks, which were not recorded. They were extemporized, but they recorded them and they listened to them many times over, taking notes, checking names, double checking dates, doing a kind of work which they never did in a physical class. They learned way more. Of course, I would have preferred to be in Paris once a week to teach that class because I like traveling, because in Paris there is good bread, and I like taking a walk on the riverside before going to class. So I hope I can go back to Paris as soon as possible. But that class worked fine. That class worked fine, and nobody died. I hope so. So it's a complicated. Well, that was about electronic communication. In the case of this notation and fabrication, the argument is simple and clear-cut. Standardized, centralized mass production is wasteful. Because if you standardize, you must mass produce a lot of stuff that you don't need. Digital mass customization is virtuous. It is economic. It is cheaper. Everything is made to measure when you need it, where you need it, as you need it. It saves raw materials, energy, labor, time. It's good for the environment, good for labor, and good for us, and good for the consumer. There is a little problem because robots will replace human workers. That's a bit problematic. We shall discuss that in another occasion. Because if everyone is replaced by a robot, who's going to pay salaries? But the normal answer that the left gives to that is universal salary. If robots do all the work, and we can live without doing the work because the robots do it for us, a universal basic salary is not utopian. It's the most reasonable way to go. And many liberal thinkers and many moderate and liberal economists have come to the same conclusion. It's simply, it makes sense. I don't mind about exploiting robots. Let them work 18 hours a day, so long as we don't have to do it. If they tell us that the robotic revolution will give us the time to play tennis from sunrise to sunset, I don't see a problem with that, so long as someone is paying the same salary to all. Because the wealth will be produced by the army of slave labor of the robots. Robots, in the original etymological term, in Czech, when the term was invented in 1922, it meant slave labor. Robotic labor etymologically meant slave labor. That's why the term was invented. It's a Czech term. I've already spoken too much again.
No, there is a question from Jasmine. Is there not, however, an impoverishment of teaching, of design teaching, when it becomes completely disembodied? I don't know if you maybe have already answered this.
Yes, there is. No. I do miss the fact that I like to see my students. I want to see not only their nose, I like to see how they move, how they dress, which kind of shoes they're wearing. And I like to speak, yeah, of course, I'm a human being. But this is an emergency. So, and now the point is when we go back, when the emergency is over, and at some point it will be, we will have learned that for some specific tasks, this technology works fine. When I go back teaching fully the old normal way, I will probably still keep a few classes online because I have evidence that they work fine. And I presume many will agree because we have tried, we have the experience, we have the expertise, and we know that in many cases, not in every case, in some cases, a complementarity of physical teaching and cyber teaching is probably the best way to go. It all depends on what you're teaching. You're teaching, dentistry is probably not a good way to go.
Thank you, Mario. If there is a second question, we'll wait for that. If not, I want to start thanking you for your wisdom, for the provocation of today, and the perspective on our COVID condition. Actually, I think you brought to the table parallels between what we're going through today and what was theorized in the 90s that I hadn't thought before. And actually, this makes a lot of sense in terms of what is to come, and maybe the promise that that work had and was never fulfilled, and now it is.
Realize that we are meeting in cyberspace. We are meeting, you and me and the 50 students, we are meeting in cyberspace. It's happening. It took 30 years. It took a pandemic. Now we know that cyberspace can, in some specific circumstances, work. And when we no longer are obliged to use it, my guess is we shall still keep some of it, because we have evidence of how we can make it work. Time will tell.
Yes,
One thing for certain, I'm looking forward to the point in time when I can destroy Zoom and not use it for 6 months. That's, it's a knee-jerk reaction. At some point, I'm going to do that.
Zoom has been the Zoom arrest for all of us, I think. But, it's maybe the only tool right now. But
a Zoom embargo. Don't even mention it for a few months.
Fantastic. So thank to all the students for being here, and thank to Mario for your enlightening lecture and for the provocation. And we'll see all of you guys at 6 on Instagram for the movie night between Florencia and Ramirez Diaz Granados. And I know that you all now have your classes with your instructor, so thank you for being here.
Have fun.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Mario. Gracias.
Bye-bye.
Bye.